Good afternoon, all. I'm pleased to welcome you to what I think is going to be a wonderful discussion. I'm Jessica Matthews, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we're here to talk about, as we see the launch of the Obama 2.0, to talk about arms control 2.0, where we got to in the first administration, why did it get stuck? Where do we stand both substantively and politically in both the U.S. and Russia? And perhaps most important, what steps might be possible to be taken in that context realistically now? And for that, we have a wonderful panel to discuss this with you. Before I introduce them, I want to emphasize that what we're here to also recognize is the launch of this policy outlook study that was a project funded by the Plowshares Fund. And the president of the Plowshares Fund is with us today, Joe Cirincione, and we recognize him and thank Plowshares for its vision on this, I think, enormously interesting and very realistic, productive, practical study in a field that too often gets highly off in the wild blue. But our panelists today, next to me, Steve Pfeiffer, who finished a 25-year career in the Foreign Service, served in senior positions in the White House, on the National Security Council, in the State Department, in the European Bureau, and as ambassador to Ukraine, focused on these issues throughout his Foreign Service career, and is now senior fellow at Brookings and the director of Brookings Arms Control Initiative. Next to him is James Acton, senior associate here at Carnegie, a physicist by training who has spent the last several years thinking deeply about nuclear stability at low numbers and at the rethinking of deterrence that is part and parcel of that very long path. He's authored a number of books on this subject and is the editor of the study we're looking into today. Next to him is Bridge Colby, who is principal analyst and division chief in the Global Strategic Affairs Division at the Center for Naval Analysis in its Strategic Initiatives Group. He served on the DoD team both in the negotiation of New START and in its ratification, so was deeply involved in that, has served as an expert advisor to the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission, and as a special assistant in the office of the director of DNI, Director of National Intelligence. Served also as a member of the President's WMD Commission. So we have three experts who bring very different perspectives on these issues, and I think what we're going to do is have an exchange up here and try to divide the time half and half between our conversation and your conversation. So let's start. And Steve, maybe you can try to summarize for us, particularly with respect to Russia, post New START. Where did things stand? Where did the hopes for a successor treaty get blocked? And where do we stand today?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this panel.
Thank you for being here.
I think with Russia, the starting point is, I think the Russians on nuclear arms control have been in a holding pattern for the last 18 months. I heard from Russian officials as early as late spring of 2011 that they were not prepared to do anything in terms of nuclear arms reductions negotiations beyond New START until 2013. And the rationale was that they weren't sure who was going to be in the White House now. And I think their calculation was there was a certain risk from their perspective of getting into another negotiation with the Obama administration. You get two-thirds of the way there, there's an election, and all of a sudden you have somebody in the White House who might go in a very different direction. And I think likewise there was probably a pause in their efforts on missile defense. So the question is, what do they want to do now? I think this is going to be one of the things that will become visible once you have that first senior level interaction between American officials and Russian officials. Right after the election, President Putin made it clear that he would like to have an early meeting with President Obama. I think President Obama remains interested in pursuing further nuclear reductions. And the question really is, now that Putin knows who he's going to be dealing with for the next 4 years, what's his answer to that question going to be?
Just before we switch to the U.S., I mean, the picture you paint is a bit more positive than it seems Putin's foreign policy context has been in the last 3-4 months. Can give us a sense of your feeling on that?
Oh, first of all, I try to be a little bit optimistic by nature, but I think there actually are some reasons for the Russians to think about further nuclear reductions. In the same way that we're looking at how we recapitalize our nuclear forces and how we're going to manage the costs, I think they have some cost issues as well. If you go back a year ago when President Putin was running for election, he made some fairly significant and expensive promises in the social sector. And if the price of energy, the price of oil, for example, goes down, he may find that he has to make some guns versus butter choices. I also think that for the Russian military, there are a couple things that they are a little bit nervous about in terms of the New START treaty. One being that if you look at how the two sides have implemented their reductions, the Russians appear to be taking complete missiles out of service. The U.S. is taking warheads off of missiles, but will still maintain, I think, 700 deployed strategic warheads. And under the treaty, the United States would have
700 deployed delivery.
700 deployed strategic delivery vehicles. The United States would have the ability under a New START, if that treaty broke down, to probably add about 1,000 ballistic missile warheads to the force. And the Russians can't replicate at this point. So the question for them is, do they want to build back up and build more capability, which will cost money, or perhaps engage in a second round that might bring the numbers down? So I think...
so they have some real reasons.
I think there are some real reasons, and I think it's certainly worth a try. I mean, at the end of the day, in 6 months, we may conclude the Russians are not prepared to another agreement. But I think we ought to make that push before we write that off.
So, Bridget, let's look up the other end of the avenue. What do you see in terms of both the substantive and political context here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably be a little bit more skeptical about the future or the prospects of a successor treaty than Ambassador Pfeiffer. I mean, I think the way, the more sort of skeptical side of the arms control discussion would look at the question is, obviously there are people who are sort of reject arms control in toto, and they're not going to be interested in any kind of treaty, and that's going to be hard. But that's probably a relatively rump group, given that you saw something like New START was able to be implemented. But I think the question, say, just from my own personal perspective, is what is the value of what is the sort of national security value of a further arms control agreement with Russia? It is possible that there is an arms control agreement, strategic arms control agreement, or tactical arms control agreement to be made with the Russians that would involve reductions on our side. But reductions per se, to me, is the wrong way of looking at it. I mean, to me, and I think James and I have worked on some things together where, at least in this respect, I think we agree that things like stability, improving the stability of the forces, diminishing the possibility of misunderstanding, either in the kind of arms control context or in crisis, those things are valuable. I think you're more and more going to get to the question of whether future arms control agreements are driven by the pursuit of the goal of a world without nuclear weapons, which is President Obama's stated aspiration as well as many other respected figures, or are you going to go for this sort of stability model? I think something like New START, which was a sort of a stopgap extension treaty, effectively, you could kind of elide those differences. But I think going forward, people are going to sort of say, well, are you actually going to cut out one leg of the triad if you're going to do substantial reductions? For instance, the ICBM force, the bomber force. And then that's going to raise stability questions, and politically it's going to make it harder to do. I kind of think of it as like a trapeze act, that you have to hold the Russians, you have to hold the interagency, and you have to hold the Congress together. And with New START, that barely was doable. But I think for future treaties, it's going to be harder because whereas the administration could promise, a very ambitious and I think commendable reinvestment scheme for both the strategic delivery vehicles as well as the nuclear enterprise as a whole, that's going to be harder to promise in the future while also making progress, say, on disarmament objectives. So I think it just becomes more difficult. It's not to say that there aren't strategic arms agreements out there to be made with the Russians. I think there are, but the goal of reductions, I think, is going to be harder to square with other objectives.
Okay, James, you're sitting in the middle. You've heard two views. What's your sense on how do you break the logjam?
Well, the first thing to say is there is at its core, I think, a very deep strategic disagreement between the United States and Russia about what the purpose of arms control should be. The United States is primarily worried about Russian nuclear weapons. Particularly Russian tactical nuclear weapons has been set out as the next priority for the next round, but Russian strategic weapons as well. Russia is primarily worried about U.S. conventional weapons. When the Russians put their list of priorities, it's ballistic missile defenses at the top of the list, it's high-precision conventional weapons next on the list. Sometimes the Russians bring up this issue of the upload potential, the U.S. ability to add warheads in storage onto delivery vehicles, and sometimes they don't bring up that. But that's the only nuclear concern with the United States that the Russians even sometimes bring up is this upload potential. And so from a treaty perspective, I think there's an awful lot that should be done to make the world to reduce nuclear risks. I think that strategic disagreement is going to make it very, very hard to get to a next treaty, which is unfortunate, but I think that's the reality. I mean, the one area that I would disagree slightly with Ambassador Pfeiffer on is, I think the budgetary pressures on Russia are smaller than you do. And I think the reason for that is, with the Russians very heavily investing in this kind of infamous new highly MIRVed liquid-fueled ICBM, the Russians can keep warhead numbers high relatively cheaply. I mean, if you can stick 10 or 12 or 14 or however many they're planning warheads onto a single missile, you can keep your force as really pretty large at relatively low cost. Now, the US, for very good reasons, hasn't gone down that route and won't go down that route. So I don't see the budgetary pressures pushing Russia in a reductions direction that it wouldn't otherwise want to go in. And I think for me that forces us to search for a new way forward on arms control, one that works towards the goal of a future treaty, which I still think is absolutely the right goal, but tries to find incremental ways of moving there, probably outside a treaty-based framework for the time being.
What about budgetary pressures here? Does anybody see that as a significant factor?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think budgetary issues come up a lot in discussions about, for instance, getting rid of the triad. But I'm less worried. I mean, I think when you really pare back, I guess the onion, if you will, of decisions about the future constitution of the U.S. strategic force, well, the bombers are going to be built anyway because they're conventional. Therefore, the Air Force, they're central to the Air Force's mission. The Air Force is above all, primarily, and in its origin, a strategic bombing organization. And if you make conventional bombers, you can make them nuclear at a relatively incremental cost when you're talking at this scale. Whether you have the diversity of bomber forces that you do today with both penetrating and standoff is another issue. I think you should, but that's a different issue. The ICBMs themselves, depending on how you move forward with them, the silos are there, the infrastructure is there, the missiles can be built, again, at a relatively incremental cost. If you went into some kind of new approach, that would obviously be more expensive, but that's something where there's trade space within the decision to maintain that. And by far the most expensive element of the triad is the strategic submarines, but that's also the element of the triad that everybody agrees is the most stable, the most secure, and so forth. And I think when you look at it at the whole, the U.S., it seems to me, and this gets into a broader discussion about where are we going to allocate our defense resources in the future, it seems to me that we probably think we're going to be in an environment with at least some degree of serious strategic risk, and we're not going to want to take the risk of really downgrading our high-level strategic capabilities, and that includes nuclear. You're more likely to see cost savings, and hopefully we will, from ground forces, from counterinsurgency kind of assets. And so I worry less. Of course, I think it's important that everybody stay engaged or who believes in this, that they make this argument. But I don't see cost as really a genuine, I loathe to use the word legitimate, but an actual rationale for significant reductions to our force.
Okay, let me just say what I should have said at the beginning, which is to invite all three of you to leap in when you want to. But Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'd be a little bit more pessimistic on the cost question, just in terms of thinking, if at the latter half of this decade, in the 2020s, we're building a new ballistic missile submarine, a new ICBM, and a new penetrating bomber, I think that crowds out a lot of the money that the Defense Department would for other programs. So you may have to think in some creative ways about capitalization or recapitalization of the force. So, for example, instead of building a new ICBM, could you find a way to extend the life of Minuteman III, so push that to the right, so you could deconflict it from the time when you're going to be spending lots of money on ballistic missile submarines? So I do think there are some cost issues here. And it does then, if you're looking towards the future force, and again, why I think arms control may have a budgetary rationale. If we get to a situation where you figure that you can get by with a fewer number of ballistic missile submarines, if you get to a situation where you say, okay, this agreement allows the Russians to come down in a way that we're comfortable, where instead of having 400 ICBMs, we only have to make 200, potentially, not immediately, but potentially you can have, I think, some fairly major cost savings out there.
It's very hard to get the timing of that kind of thing working, though. I mean, I entirely agree with your budgetary diagnosis. I mean, if you look at what the Pentagon's spending list is, which includes renewing every single aspect of the force, apart from the D5 ballistic missile, but everything else needs renewing. All of the warheads, almost all of the warheads, needs life extending. There's the infrastructure spending. I don't see how the US affords all of that on the timeline that's currently set out. So I agree with Steve that I think there's likely to be budgetary pressures. I think it's quite hard, though, unfortunately, to use arms control as a way of budget cutting. I mean, arms control works on a timetable set by the Russians. Budget cutting works on a timetable set by Congress. You might be lucky and those two timetables might happen to be running in sync. But much more likely, those two timetables won't be running in sync.
Why could you not plan for them to run in sync?
Well, because the administration because the administration doesn't have control of either timetable. I mean, you can write down a plan that involves negotiating with Congress at the same time as negotiating with the Russians, but those kind of plans don't always come to fruition.
Okay, well, let's unless anybody else wants to say another. I mean, it does seem to me, as I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll put it in my own, that what Steve described is crowding out the 21st century for 20th century weapon systems and systems designed for a 20th century threat environment, and doesn't really reflect what we're not at yet, but at a world where we would recognize that there are choices to be made in the defense budget, just as there are in every other budget going ahead. But let's turn to the alternatives to negotiating an arms control treaty with the Russians, and maybe James, you would just kind of lay out and give an overview of the ideas that are in here, and then invite Steve and Bridge to talk about some of the specifics.
Well, I mean, almost from throughout the Obama administration, one of the things that the administration has said is, in addition to arms control, formal treaty-based arms control, we support transparency and confidence building with Russia and with other states as well. And this is something that you hear repeatedly said, but you very often see you don't often see flesh put on the bone. What kind of confidence building measures? What would their goal be? What kind of transparency measures? What would their goal be? And so, as throughout the second half of the Obama administration first term, arms control with Russia looked like it was getting harder and harder and was getting more and more bogged down. One of the avenues that I wanted to start to explore was for more informal confidence building and transparency measures. What could be done that would ideally reduce nuclear risks while paving the way for the next treaty? And what could be done without outside of a legal-based framework? There's one idea that had been floating around there a lot, really since the ink on New START was dry, and that was the idea of reciprocal unilateral reductions. That's not an issue we discussed here, but simply because it had been discussed extensively elsewhere. And so, I invited a bunch of creative thinkers into a room and locked them in the room until they came up with some ideas. I will let Bridge and Steve highlight their own ideas. And there's a number of authors, I can't see where you are from the paper, scattered around the room. But let me very briefly highlight two ideas that I think are worth highlighting, both related to tactical nuclear weapons, of the kind of thing that can be doable in the short term. The first one is an idea that Jeffrey Lewis contributed to the paper on sea-launched cruise missiles. The US has announced its intention to dismantle its remaining system of sea-launched cruise missile, nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles. We don't know how many the Russians deploy, or indeed whether they do deploy them. There's ambiguous evidence that I won't go into, but there's fears that Russia might be creating a new generation of nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles. Now, this was a problem that came up in the original START 1 negotiation, and it wasn't dealt with in the treaty text itself, but there was a side transparency agreement for each side to make declarations of the number of nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles it had deployed. And so one step you could very simply take with these systems is just to restart the START transparency arrangement and start redeclaring details about the number of sea-launched cruise missiles that are deployed. A second idea that Ambassador Linton Brooks made in his contribution is to start working seriously on joint verification experiments. You know, the US has said, and certainly unofficially floated the idea of a single limit on all warheads. No matter what type of warhead it is, let's have a single limit. Now that creates some verification challenges. But one thing you could do is you could have the US and Russia on a reciprocal basis, inviting one another into their storage areas with whatever security precautions the host state wants. And see, with those security precautions, can you accurately count the number of warheads in the storage area? Now, presumably in the first instance, the answer will be no. In the first instance, the states may very well insist on dummy warheads. But that would at least get the inspectors there thinking about how to solve this problem in a very practical way. And those are kind of two of the practical measures. Stephen Bridge can talk about their own as well. But that's the kind of thing I think it ought to be possible to do. It doesn't require a treaty, and it both reduces nuclear risks in the short term and helps pave the way for a new treaty in the longer term.
Hey, Steve, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just make a general point, which is I don't think we should think about this as arms control has to be a treaty or something else. You can do both. And certainly over the last 40 years, you can find lots of examples of things that the United States, the Soviet Union, Russia did without having a full treaty. So, I would argue, I still think there's a chance at getting a treaty. We ought to pursue that. But we can also be pursuing some of these other ideas in parallel. And in fact, the idea that James mentioned, if you can do that and actually begin to get those measures working, that would actually facilitate achievement of a treaty later on. The specific idea that I offered to James goes to the question of missile defense. And I proceed from the premise, I think the Russians have a valid point on missile defense. And that is, if American missile defenses increase in quantity and increase in quality, at some point they could undermine the strategic offensive balance between the United States and Russia. I think that's just a fact of the offense-defense relationship. Now, I disagree with the Russians when they say that point's going to be hit in the next 10 years. And my suggestion was that the United States could, and I think a lot of this information is already publicly available in budget documents, but give to the Russians, and ideally this would be done reciprocally, where the Russians would be giving us a declaration as well, but a declaration that would say, for each year looking at over the next 10 years, for each key element of our missile defense systems, this is the maximum number we plan to have. So you could take ground-based interceptor missiles, you could break the SM-3 interceptor down by different blocks, launchers, associated radars. So you give them a list of about 15 or 20 elements. And you say, for each year now, we're going to tell you how many we plan to have in that year. And then, moreover, we will give you advance notice if any of those numbers are going to change. So it looks to me like it takes about 2 years from a decision to build an SM-3 missile to actually having it in the force. So you can tell the Russians, if we're going to increase an SM-3 number, you're going to get 18 to 24 months notice. What that gives the Russians, if they're if they're not just holding up this missile defense thing to block progress, but if they want to have a real exchange, that gives them a very full picture, updated every year, of what American missile defense will look like, from which they can say, is that going to be a problem for us or not? Now, it requires that the Russians accept that the United States will be pursuing a missile defense, that there will be missile defense elements deployed in places like Romania and Poland. But it is a vehicle by which I think the United States could assure the Russians that looking over the next 10 to 15 years, there is no threat. Now, the crunch point may be 15, 20 years down the road. If there is some missile defense breakthrough, there actually may be a real issue there. But I think that this is a way to tell the Russians there's not going to be the sort of threat that you fear to your strategic forces.
And do you see any prospect in this, say, next 10 years for more actual cooperation on radar or whatever, on basing on?
Well, my hope is that if you could do something like this, that this would be part of a package, and then the Russians would have to fall off their demand for a legal guarantee that American missile defenses are not going to be directed at Russia, because in the current climate, there is no way that you could get a 2/3 vote in the Senate for that. Anything that looks remotely like a limit on missile defense is going to be as problematic as raising taxes. But I think if the United States offered a bit more transparency, made a couple of other offers, the Russians moved off of that, there's already, from what I understand, a fairly significant degree of convergence in terms of Pentagon ideas and Russian military ideas from exchanges back in 2011, where they talked about things like transparency, joint exercises. They got into fairly detailed conversations on this idea of two missile defense centers. One, a data fusion center, where you take data from NATO sources and Russian sources, combine it, and then send the enhanced product back to both sides. So that would, for example, give the United States access to data from the Russian radar at Armavir, which probably has the best view of Iran, of anyone's radar. So that would be valuable. And then a second center that would be planning and operations, where you talk about rules of engagement and how the systems would work together. So it wouldn't be a single system, but it would be two systems working together very closely.
If we can't get there, we read all the time that missile defense cooperation is a game changer, both positively and negatively. If we couldn't pursue the cooperation you just described, do you see Russian willingness to move forward on some of the other ideas that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, certainly, I think in terms of a new nuclear reductions treaty, I think you probably don't get that without coming up with some settlement of the missile defense issue. There may be some of these other ideas that are of interest. I think one of the ideas was to talk about, for example, cruise missiles and conventional cruise missiles. I was at a meeting in Moscow about 2.5 years ago, where we heard from several Russian think tankers that they were very concerned about the ability of American cruise missiles to attack Russian strategic forces. Right. Now, when I went back, I was then out at Strategic Command, and I asked some people out there, and they were very dubious about that. They did not think that conventional American cruise missiles had the explosive power to have much chance of disabling an ICBM silo. Now, that seems to me, I mean, I'm not an explosive expert or an expert in hardened silos, but that seems to be an engineering question. If you got the smart people together, they could actually have a conversation. Is there a real problem here or not? Right. At least what they're thinking out in Strategic Command is that this Russian problem is really not very serious. But it's one, as James mentioned, they continually raise.
Bridge, you want to add some of the other ideas that are laid out here?
Sure. Well, I think Ambassador Pfeiffer just explained our James's and my proposal very well, and I agree with him entirely that a lot of the steps that we can take with the Russians can be done outside of the treaty framework, and I didn't want to set up too much of an opposition between the kind of disarmament versus sort of stability mindset, because there are a lot of things you can do. As if you want to do both, as I think James is probably the premier example of somebody who's trying to reconcile those things. We don't have to solve all the problems right now, but this is the kind of thing where both sides can gain from the kind of experiment that we're talking about, which would basically be to probably initially have the National Academy of Science of the United States and of the Russian Federation conduct a joint study into looking at the ability of conventional cruise missiles to damage or destroy a hardened silo. You could also do it against other targets that would be of concern, like strategic command and control, for instance. Obviously, this has to be made compatible with security requirements on both sides and so forth and so on, but those are the kind of problems that are familiar. The advantages to the Russians are relatively clear, and I think Ambassador Pfeiffer laid it out, which is to say, well, are our silos in danger or not, to the extent that an experiment like this could solve that question. But for us, it's also valuable as well, because we do incur something of a political cost by having the Russians kind of delegitimize our use of conventional cruise missiles. This is something that's been a problem for us for a long time, and we would gain politically in the ability of our forces to operate with less of a kind of political overhang from something like this. We'd also gain from not having the Russians be on such an itchy trigger finger. It's not like they're going to launch a first strike tomorrow, but all things being equal, we don't want the Russians to think that the appearance of an American attack submarine somewhere in their vicinity means that their survivable second strike is in jeopardy. That benefits us too. So these are the kinds of common advantage things that we can find, small wins, and whether they lead to something different, it doesn't all need to be tied together. We can do this and that and this and that. And in some sense, I think a treaty is problematic, because you do need to try to wrap everything together. And James well pointed out that so the procurement schedules are not on the same time. Ted Warner, my old boss, liked to point out that we're going through a Russian recapitalization period right now. Well, the whole Reagan era buildup, which has not been tended to or not been continued since the end of the Cold War, is coming to an end in the 2020s and 2030s, and that's why we have all these things coming online. So I think if we can find these sort of smaller wins, that's advantageous. Other things where we might find advantages, obviously missile defense is one area, but another is if and when we do move forward with prompt strike, whether global or a more regional variety, we don't want the Russians to think that this is something that is oriented to or is highly tailored to attacking their second strike capability, because we're developing it for a range of contingencies. And so if there are things we can do, like segregating the launch point, if it's a land-based system, for instance, which I think the Obama administration has already offered as an idea, those are things that are worth pursuing and can be done outside of the treaty context and make sense just on strategic grounds.
James, maybe this may complicate the story a little bit too much, but you've just taken a look at the prospects, long-term prospects of China's addition to the bilateral arms control picture. Do you want to just say a few words on looking ahead over this coming 4 years, whether you see any opportunities there?
Sure. As US and Russian numbers come down, for whatever reason, as a matter of political reality, China's nuclear arsenal is going to loom larger in American and Russians' minds. And actually, the official Russian position on arms control right now is the next round must be multilateral. And that's primarily about China. Now, is that a negotiating position? Probably. But it's nonetheless, significant that, even at the moment, the Russians are saying China has to be involved in the next round. And one can argue strategically at what point China ought to be included in arms control. The total US arsenal is still probably a factor of about 20 bigger than the total Chinese arsenal. But at some point sooner or later, it's going to have to be dealt with. So the issue that I highlighted is, so far the US has had relatively little success talking state to state with China about nuclear doctrine and nuclear weapons. One can point to a few potential signs of progress, but it's been very tough recently. So one idea that I put out there in a recent publication is to focus on the ways in which instability at the nuclear level can be driven by interactions at the conventional level. Let me give you one example. The United States is deploying, let's start from China. China is developing conventional ballistic missiles for regional missions. The United States is deploying theater ballistic missile defenses in the region, partly to deal with those conventional ballistic missiles. But China worries that those theater interceptors could turn into national missile defense interceptors that could undermine China's strategic deterrent. Okay? That is one example of how instability at the conventional level can feed up into instability at the nuclear level. There seems to me a clear mutual benefit for both the United States and China in mitigating the worst aspect of these instabilities. So rather than trying to kind of pair up US nukes with Chinese nukes and do negotiations or talks or transparency or whatever on that very asymmetric basis, What about trying to do things like transparency about Chinese regional conventional missiles in return for transparency about US theater missile interceptors? That's the basic idea there.
I don't know if either of you wanted to add anything on this point.
I just think James' point, right now the U.S. and Russian arsenals each are about 20 times the size of the Chinese. So it would seem to me that there is room for one more bilateral treaty.
Right.
I mean, you could cut American and Russian arsenals in half, and they're still an order of magnitude larger than any third country.
Right.
And that pushes down, because I think it's hard enough dealing the U.S. and Russia in a bilateral negotiation. When you start to bring in third countries, it's going to become much more complex.
Before we open it up, let me just circle back with you, Steve, to where we started. There certainly was a period in the recent past where the Russians felt that only a formal arms control negotiation sufficiently recognized their status as a superpower, or a just was superpower, or let's say superpower. What do they still feel that way?
No, I think actually above and beyond the nuclear reductions, the arms control negotiations and that treaty have political importance to Moscow, where you still have many in the elite seeking to see themselves and Moscow as a superpower on par with the United States, in the same way it was during the Cold War. So this kind of agreement, I think, has political value because it is a validation that, yes, Russia is a superpower in that one category of nuclear weapons.
Right.
And they don't have a lot of other categories that they can point to.
You argued it doesn't have to be either or. We can do both. Non-treaty measures and the formal treaty negotiation. But do the Russians, how would they feel about that opportunity?
Yeah. I think they prefer the treaty, but you may be able to get some additional measures above and beyond that. But we have seen how much the Russians have liked the treaty. I mean, there have been some arguments made that you can only do arms control by treaty, which I think is just wrong and is not consistent with the last 40 years. So if you go back, for example, 10 years ago in the Bush 43 administration, when they completed their nuclear posture review, they concluded that the United States needed 1,700 to 2,200 operationally deployed strategic warheads, regardless of what Russia and China did. Basically, it was sort of this is what we need, and we don't care about the rest of the world. In the fall of 2001, when President Bush was meeting with President Putin, the American proposal was that we don't need formal treaties. Why don't we just go out there, and I will say, President Bush will say, this is the number of weapons we have, and then you can say how many Russia's going to have. But arms control by mutual statements. And in fact, President Putin said no, he wanted to have a treaty. And at the end, I think President Bush agreed to that direct appeal from Putin.
You want to add to that?
Yeah, and Steve's point is very important because some of you may have seen an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal over the Christmas period when, in fact, two of the officials in that administration
one of whom had senior responsibility for arms control, by the way,
was arguing that exactly that kind of policy that the Bush administration had publicly come out in favor of in 2001 was unconstitutional. Now, I suspect if you're like me, you may have been a little bit surprised seeing John Yoo write an op-ed about the extreme limits on presidential power in matters of peace and defense. But this is clearly a very, very different issue, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt there.
Okay. All right, let's open up the conversation, and please introduce yourself, and we'll start right here. Okay, come on.
Thanks. Rachel Oswald, Global Security Newswire. This is for Stephen Pfeiffer. I wanted to go back toward your idea about having the United States provide annual declarations of missile defense numbers. Do you see those as being public? And also, given that Russia has called for data alongside any legal guarantee that would ascertain for them capabilities, do you think they would really be okay with just verbal declarations that could be discontinued under a new U.S. presidency that are not accompanied by any kind of site visits? And would you also suggest those?
Yeah. Well, this is one element of what I think would be several offers the United States could make to try to facilitate a cooperative NATO-Russian missile defense. One, I don't think it's going to be too hard to pull out the numbers. I mean, in my particular section of the paper, I give 10 numbers, Those numbers I got from a Congressional Research Service document. So I think a lot of this information is out there. Second, there are other offers that have already been made on the table. For example, a year ago, the head of the Missile Defense Agency said he would be happy to invite Russian observers to come and observe standard SM-3 missile tests. And his argument being that when they see that, and including using their own equipment to observe the test, they would see that the interceptor does not have either the range or the velocity to engage in an intercontinental ballistic missile. So again, since we're building these systems not designed against the Russians, I think making that kind of information available that would make them more comfortable about the capabilities, and this is actually something in many ways, given where the tests are, the Russians can probably do from international waters, but sort of facilitating that. I think there are two other things where I think NATO and American policy might change on missile defense. One would be is this position which, on the part of NATO, that is, if there was a cooperative missile defense, it would not in any way change American and NATO plans for missile defense. And I guess I would alter that and say, we would be prepared to consider Russian ideas, provided those ideas did not degrade the ability of NATO missile defenses to defend NATO territory. And I'll give you an example that a Russian raised to me at one point. He said, if you look at the plan for Phase 3 of the European Phased Adaptive Approach, the location proposed for American missile interceptors in Poland is on the Baltic Sea, quite close to Kaliningrad, which has political sensitivities for the Russians. Now, his question was, would NATO ever consider relocating that to a Polish military installation in southwest Poland, which would move it away from Kaliningrad, but also would move it away from ICBM tracks from Russia to the United States? Now, I think NATO's position right now would be no. What I would argue is before saying no, NATO ought to ask itself, could it in that location still be able to defend in the same way NATO territory? And if the answer to that question was yes, then it might be worth thinking about. The other change, and I think there's some ambiguity in this position if you're in Russia, is what we plan to do with Phase 4. And I would think it would be useful for the administration to make a statement saying that it would not, or it could defer deployment of the Phase 4 SM-3 interceptor, which is the missile interceptor of most concern to Russia because that's the one that's supposed to have capabilities against ICBMs, but that the administration would defer that deployment if it became evident that Iran was not progressing towards an ICBM. And I think that makes, the point that the Phase 4 in Europe is linked to an Iranian capability. If that capability doesn't develop, then we don't need to deploy that defense, which is the one of greatest concern to the Russians. And again, hopefully those things would then bring the Russians around to moving off their demand for a legal guarantee and move us into a position where we could actually set up a cooperative defense.
I saw a hand right. Yes.
Thank you. This question is for James. Justin Anderson, SAIC. And James, I wanted to press you a little on something you said earlier. First of all, I agree with your assessment that a problem for arms control is differing strategic assessments between the United States and Russia, and Russian concerns about U.S. A mismatch in things like conventional capabilities. So given that their concerns lie in those areas, I was wondering if you could walk me further as to how transparency and confidence building measures helps that. It would seem to me that transparency and confidence building may simply confirm to them that they're behind in some areas they consider absolutely vital and doesn't necessarily help us get closer to further nuclear arms control negotiations.
Great question.
Thanks.
Yeah, it is a great question, and I actually have written before, somewhat heretically, that transparency can be a bad thing at times. The best example is the Anglo-German naval arms race before the First World War. I think there's a very strong case to be made that was fueled by transparency. I take the attitude that transparency is generally, and this is not my dictum. This is actually was a brilliant article, very little known, that Steve Fetter wrote on the subject. Transparency is broadly stabilizing when both sides are broadly happy with the status quo, which I think is true between the US and Russia right now. Russia has concerns about changes in the status quo, but it's broadly happy with the status quo. And, I start from the assumption that where these conventional forces are concerned, the United States cannot undermine Russia's nuclear deterrent. even if cruise missiles are vulnerable to silos. Sorry, other way around. Silos are vulnerable to cruise missiles, and I don't think they are. The reality is the most survivable Russian forces are their Rose mobile ballistic missiles. So I think what transparency about things like conventional prompt global strike, about cruise missiles, about ballistic missile defense can do is convince Russia, provide Russia with a genuine set of evidence that allows Russians to judge with their own eyes that US conventional capabilities do not degrade Russia's strategic deterrent in any meaningful way. Now, if those studies happen to conclude, I think extremely unlikely, but one can't rule out the possibility from the start that those studies might actually indicate there is a problem. But in that case, I think it's very important the US knows about it, because the fundamental debate about strategic deterrence, I think, is it a good idea to threaten the other side's strategic forces or not? Do I get more out of deterrence or risk instability if I threaten the other side's strategic forces? Now, I come very, very firmly down on the side that we don't want to threaten Russia's strategic forces. If Russia believes its strategic forces could be eliminated in a crisis, that is a recipe for deep instability in a crisis. And so, in the very unlikely event these transparency exercises do conclude that Russia's strategic forces are at risk, I actually think that's something we want to know, but I'm pretty confident it doesn't come out that way.
Did you want to add anything on that? Okay.
Well, it's more important that Russia knows it too, right?
Right.
They can take corrective action.
No, absolutely.
All the way up front? Maybe if you guys stand in the middle, it wouldn't take so long.
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. The panelists have talked about Russia and China in the context of our negotiating partners or potential partners in strategic arms control. But the security concern in the minds of many members of Congress and much of the public are Iranian and North Korean nuclear weapons. And in fact, during the New START debates and even subsequently, a lot of the opponents of considering significant reductions are worried about third country or fourth country nuclear challenges. So I guess my question for the panelists is, how does Iran and North Korea, which currently have 0 nuclear-tipped ICBMs, how do they play into our thinking about next steps? Or can one sort of put that on the table and say, this is not about these countries, this is about Russia and China?
Kurt, go ahead.
Well, I guess the first thing, and I was thinking of chiming in earlier, about China, I think it's technically true from a numerical point of view, as Ambassador Pfeiffer pointed out, that and James as well, that the differences between the United States arsenal and China's are very steep. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's at least a debatable point, and it certainly seems, if not the central debate, it's one of the central debates in defense circles right now, is how much of a challenge is China posing, and what's the trajectory of the strategic relationship there. And there are those, including myself, who think that nuclear forces may become more salient in the Sino-U.S. relationship as the conventional balance in the Pacific develops, and as China's strategic behavior develops as well. So I think it's a very, and this gets to the point of thinking of, I think, arms control as a strategic action, not a quantitative action, in the sense that we need to take China's nuclear forces, its conventional forces, its political and strategic behavior into account. So that's a factor. In terms of Iran and North Korea, I mean, I certainly don't think it's relevant in strict sort of forces terms with respect to something like the New START Treaty or present levels or the constitution of the force. Where it does come into play, obviously there's sort of these perceptual things, about the sort of potency of the U.S. extended deterrent. I mean, I'm not too worried about that given the size of our forces, conventional and nuclear and so forth, our willingness to use force. But I do think it is an advantage, and I think I'm sort of clarifying a point, at least from my perspective, that James just made, which is that we do have escalation dominance over North Korea and Iran or some other power like that, both in a conventional and, God forbid, a nuclear context. And that takes something more than just a baseline kind of monad force with a small capability. It takes the kind of highly developed force that we have today, and that has a lot of value in assuring our allies and other countries that would think about proliferating in the wake of the disaster of Iranian acquisition or North Korea's continued possession. So I think it's not a direct kind of thing. It's not like we rule out certainly strategic arms control with either Russia or China. But I mean, this is to me another argument for why we need to have a very strong, robust, capable nuclear force. You know, numbers to be negotiated, composition to be negotiated, but we want to maintain that kind of escalation dominance over countries like North Korea and Iran going forward to the extent that we can, while understanding that we exist in a different kind of relationship with Russia and China.
And I would agree with everything that Bridge just said, but I would argue that you could do that with substantially fewer U.S. nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
I mean, if we went from 5,000 total weapons to 2,000, 2,500, I don't think that's going to cause a situation where Iran or North Korea would act in a perceptibly different way towards the United States.
Well, I think just one thing that's important and that we've kind of been touching around is the issue between the sort of operational deployed force and what that looks like, particularly with respect to the strategic development or the delivery of vehicles of any kind, strategic or non-strategic, and then the whole warhead, the whole force. Yeah. And I, for one, I mean, I think there's no reason why we can't think about reducing. I mean, we're already reducing the overall stockpile for cost purposes. So there's no reason why we shouldn't consider that also in an arms control agreement. And James co-chaired a working group on U.S.-Russia nuclear relations about a year ago that I participated in that proposed, overall warhead totals as a ceiling as a viable way forward. And I think that's perfectly.
Do you want to add something, James?
Yeah, look, I just say very briefly. Personally, I don't know how easy or difficult it would be to deter a nuclear-armed Iran. I'm relatively, I would argue strongly that our ability to deter Iran, a nuclear-armed Iran or otherwise, is not very dependent at all on the size of the U.S. force. However, I think it would be naive to think that if Iran tests a nuclear weapon, there won't be tremendous knock-on effects for arms control. I mean, just for pure domestic political reasons. I find it almost unimaginable that you could take, just for, as I say, for pure political reasons, to make any progress on arms control for years after Iran tested a nuclear weapon. Which is why I think, if you want to be serious about arms control and disarmament, politically you have to be serious about non-proliferation as well.
Okay, I'll come back. I agreed one in the back right there, and then Andrew up here. You see where? Put your hand up. Yeah.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. Following up on Greg Thielman's question, I must say that I'm struck by that a discussion of arms control in the second Obama term has been in terms that would have been quite familiar when Richard Nixon was president. And I would think that most Americans, certainly most people in the Congress, would feel that the next 4 years, the problems in arms control are likely to be very different. Things related to the arms race between India and Pakistan, potential proliferation of chemical weapons from the Syrian arsenal, the kinds of things that we've seen at a conventional level from the disintegration of Libya, and that arms control in the 4 years ahead are much more likely to be about issues of that kind than about the comparatively stable relationship that exists between the United States and the Russian Federation. And I'm wondering if perhaps there may have been a bit of mismarketing of this session, that this is really about American-Russian arms control. But I would like to ask the members of the panel to at least discuss what they think is the potential influence of the United States in some of these other issues, because the message I'm taking away is that except in these kind of classic Cold War arms control areas, the message may be that the United States really may not have much influence or suasion.
Who wants to leap in there?
Well, I'll defend. I mean, I think it's a little bit unfair the way you phrase the question. I mean, there seem to be 2 points you're making, if I understand you correctly. One is we're paying too much attention to Russia. The other is we're kind of engaging in old think. And then there's sort of a broader point as to whether we can do a number of different things at the same time. I mean, to me, this critique of sort of strategic arms control of the Russians has never made much sense. We have a huge government bureaucracy. We can certainly afford a certain number of people and their time and maybe some TDY expenses to do negotiations with the Russians if it has some kind of even modest advantages, I don't think that's a reason not to do it. We can do multiple things at the same time. In terms of dealing with the Russians, clearly they are not number one on the priority agenda list for the United States. They are close to it, and I think actually in the last few years there are reasons to be a little more worried about the Russians, not just on the political level and sort of the geopolitical level, but also sort of on some of the military developments. They have made more progress in the transformation of their military capabilities. They do seem to be resentful in a number of ways, sometimes with some justification, revanchist in certain areas. So it's something that we should watch, and if we can allay or mitigate some of those dangers, by dealing with them, then I think it's a good reason to do so. In terms of the sort of old thing, I very much disagree. I mean, in terms of, if I understand you correctly, the Cold War thinking, quote unquote, and it's people are very fond of bashing it. The Soviet threat to the United States and to Western Europe posed a very intense form of what is essentially a generalizable strategic problem, and one that we see elements of potentially in the Pacific today, and you certainly see in the Indo-Pakistani context, where, for instance, a lot of people draw parallels to Pakistani thinking to American strategic thinking of the 1950s. So, in the attempt to apply these kind of strategic concepts that were developed in this very intense pressure cooker strategic environment in the 50s and 60s and 70s, I think it has a lot of value, and I think that's what I think we're all at least trying to do in terms of applying these ways of thinking to various different problems. Maybe I didn't understand your question, but that's how I took it.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, let me, both answer your question and push back against against the premise. I think in terms of public policy, when we consider what problems are urgent, we have to look at risk. And risk is probability times consequence. Now, nuclear war, thank God, is a low probability event. It's an extremely low probability event. It's also an extremely high consequence event. And to my mind, that makes this an important subject to deal with, because the overall risk is still high, in my judgment, even if the probability is low, because the consequences are so high. And when we're thinking about a deep crisis, which is the only circumstance in which the deliberate use of nuclear weapons would be imaginable, when we're thinking about a deep crisis, I actually think the classical theory of arms control is the best guide we have to reducing the probability of nuclear use in that deep crisis. So yes, the probability of a US-Russia crisis has dramatically lowered since the Cold War, and we should be very grateful for that. But given the consequences, I think we still need to be attentive to what would happen in that kind of crisis. In terms of what are other arms control problems, Iran is one that has been discussed extensively. I would just flag it up. I think in the DPRK in North Korea, I would highlight the crucial issue of preventing the onwards proliferation of nuclear materials and technology from the DPRK. I think there's very little the US can do to disarm or to disarm North Korea. I think there might be much more the US can potentially do in preventing the onwards proliferation. A lot of the difficulty is when it comes to these nuclear arms control problems, and that's, I won't talk about others because I don't know about them very much. Actually, the US, I think, has relatively little influence in that regard. The US has been trying to talk to China, and, I don't think US policy in this direction has been perfect, but I think when you look at where the barriers to progress has been, China has been very, very resistant to engaging in a dialogue with the US, so there's not much you can do there. I think there is very little that the US can do with India-Pakistan. And I don't know if George is still here, my boss, George Perkovich, but one of the points he always makes is that actually US policy is making the problems with Pakistan significantly worse at the moment. I think there's a lot of arms control problems out there. I think those that don't directly involve the US, and even some of those that do directly involve the US, there is a limit to what the US can reasonably do. As challenging as I think US-Russia is, I actually think there are opportunities for progress there. And making progress in areas where there are opportunities for progress, I don't think is a bad thing.
I think I would just wrap this up and say that one of the lessons of the last 30 years has been over and over again that vertical arms control, U.S. Russian, and horizontal arms control, non-proliferation, do not exist in separate universes. They intersect all the time. Andrew, go ahead.
following up Jessica, Andrew Pierre, on horizontal arms control. We've had an interesting discussion, I think, of China. But interestingly, also, we haven't discussed the two countries which have the greatest nuclear forces after the United States and Russia, and that is Britain and France. And each of these countries, particularly in Britain, as James knows well, there has been, for now some time, some discussion about the future of the British nuclear force. The French are more confident about maintaining their nuclear forces, but they have very severe budgetary constraints. They can't even fly their own forces into Mali. So I think the British and French, what I've always thought of as being not the next round of arms control, perhaps the round after that. Maybe we'll have to merge that all into one round many years from now. So I'd like to ask the thoughts of anybody, but perhaps on Britain, James in particular, about how this fits in. We've talked about every other potential nuclear power. I don't think the word Israeli, the name Israeli, has been mentioned. And if one talks to strategic thinkers and planners in the Middle East, certainly they're very conscious of the Israeli capabilities. And how does that fit into this broad picture, which we're now sort of engaged in?
Another question. Who wants to? Steve, do you want to start, or James? You?
I think when you look at the next step, and there's the question. I would hope that you could have one more U.S.-Russia bilateral agreement. But then I think at that point, at least from what I've heard Russians say, is below 1,000 deployed strategic warheads, they have to have something from third countries. And so I think that you would at that point have to bring in, not just China, but Britain and France. And then the question becomes, perhaps in the sense of getting them a little bit pregnant, could you get them to accept, okay, as a starting point, maybe a unilateral policy that we will not increase. I think the British are probably prepared to go along with that. They've said some things like that. I think the Chinese and the French are going to be much more difficult. In the ideal world, you would get India, Pakistan, Israel in that as well. But if you could start with those three countries, then you have the basis from the UN Security Council, P5, to go to work. But I think it's going to be a gradual process. And the trick is going to be finding some way to avoid where I think the Chinese at one point said, we're prepared to join in an arms control negotiation with the United States and Russia as soon as you get down to our levels. I don't think that idea flies either in Moscow or Washington. So can you find some way to bring them into the process by basically saying, you need to make some commitment in terms of the size of your force if the United States and Russia are going to reduce further?
James.
A few quick thoughts. Firstly, in terms of formal sit around the table negotiating type arms control, I think it's pretty clear you have to go from two to five. The Chinese don't sit there unless the British and French are there. I don't think we need to go to that in the near future. I think there's a lot we can do informally. The British talk quite a good game and say, they're willing to be involved at some point, but when you push British officials for details, they're a little bit more circumspect. When you talk to French officials, you get a very simple reaction. No. Pourquoi?
With a shrug, right?
With a shrug. It's tricky. The huge issue, though, is all in the UK. There is the potential in the next 2 years for tremendous, tremendous change in British nuclear forces, and it is all about Scottish independence. In October 2014, and this is only gradually beginning to permeate through the nuclear community, there is going to be a referendum for Scottish independence. I don't know what the probability is that Scotland is going to vote for independence, but I always say, look, it's not as high as 50%, but it's a hell of a lot higher than 5%. Where it is between 5 and 50%, I don't know. The SNP, the Scottish National Party, have said repeatedly, time and time and time again, that if Scotland votes for independence, British nuclear weapons will be removed from Scotland as soon as is safe. And there was some speculation that they were they wouldn't insist on that in independence negotiations. But they have made it impossible for themselves, I think, at this point, to allow British nukes to stay in Scotland in the event of Scottish independence. And that is virtually the whole that is the 4 British SSBNs are based there, and much more importantly, Coulport, the Royal Armaments Depot, there's the missiles and the warheads stored there. Okay, there is no plan for what happens if they're removed from Scotland. Okay, there is I mean, it is just, British officials cry when you bring the subject up. I mean, I cannot emphasize how difficult and expensive replacing these facilities would be. The most plausible plan, which I still think is deeply implausible and won't happen, is to base it all in Kings Bay, Georgia. You know, I think that is the easiest solution, but easiest solution still means extremely hard. So watch domestic Scottish politics, which I know everyone here does avidly.
Yeah, but there's also, I mean, I think there's a cost too, because if Scotland does vote to leave the Union, and the British try to come up with an answer that is other than basing at Kings Bay, the cost at that point of Britain sustaining an independent nuclear deterrent suck up the entire British defense budget. And that has ramifications for us. I mean, personally, I'm comfortable with the idea of Britain having an independent nuclear deterrent, but I also want the British to have a deployable conventional capability because, one, when you talk to the U.S. military, it's the British military that they work most comfortably with, most experienced, think in like terms, and it's been Britain that over the last 3, 4, 5 decades has been most willing to go to places and fight with us. So from an American perspective, we don't want to see a situation where an independent nuclear deterrent in Britain basically makes it where the British can't ever go any way in a conventional way with us.
Right. In the way back.
Howard Moreland, private citizen. I'm always interested in targets. I want somebody to show me a list of targets that the United States plans to destroy with nuclear weapons. And these are targets that cannot be destroyed in any other manner, and that we have to be able to destroy them. Like if it's Russian missile silos, under what circumstances do we want to destroy a Russian missile silo, period? I understand you probably can't do it without a nuclear warhead. But I'd like to know what it is, what kind of capability it is we're trying to preserve in a world in which we're not really enemies with either Russia or China. I mean, during the Cold War, Russia was not financing our national debt. We've got a whole different world now, and yet we still have this Cold War mentality. And I'd like to know what kind of capability it is we're trying to preserve with our nuclear arsenal. And if there are no targets that require nuclear weapons, why are we even trying to preserve our nuclear arsenal at all?
Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, well, that's a legitimate question. Obviously, in seminars like this, you end up talking in a very kind of sort of ethereal or bloodless tone. But I mean, look, I don't speak obviously for the U.S. government, but officially the U.S. government, when it talks about these things to the extent that it does, and nobody knows really what's in the war plan who doesn't have access to it, which is a very small number of people, they tend to talk about military or quasi-military targets. But look, the reality of the nuclear force is that it presents the very real possibility, and if they're used, the essential certainty of large-scale devastation. Which I mean, a lot of the targets, I think it's fair to assume, based on open sources, work like Desmond Ball and people like that, that would include urban targets, the cities, what are called in the bloodless terminology of strategic theory, value targets. And that's what distinguishes nuclear weapons. I think in the United States, we feel uncomfortable talking about that bluntly. And there's sort of an interesting dichotomy where, at least during the Cold War, it was often the left that emphasized the focus on value targets and the right on forces. But I think that's essentially what American nuclear forces and the nuclear forces of other countries are for. So when I think you're approaching the question as I'm kind of hearing it in a way that I wouldn't, which is to say, well, if there are military targets that we can hit with conventional forces, then that means that we don't need nuclear weapons anymore. And that's somebody like General Cartwright seems, as I understand it, seems to approach it from that point of view. And this gets to the second issue that you brought up, which is that do we live in a different world? If we live in a radically different world from all of human history that preceded 1991, where up until 1991 it was not necessarily likely, but it was certainly plausible that major general war would break out in the European theater. If we live in a completely different world, and such a world could not arise within or reemerge within the next few decades, maybe you're right. Maybe maybe we should get rid of all of those big nuclear weapons and just have weapons that are useful against fanatics like Al-Qaeda. I personally am not at all ready to take that bet. And when you're thinking about the future of the nuclear force, I think you inevitably need to take into account decades because of the costs, because of the procurement, because of the research and development. I think that the world is. I think it's people at Mike Azenko at CFR point out that the world is much safer than it has been before. I think that's absolutely right. The world of the 20th century was extraordinarily unsafe, but nonetheless, it's not perfectly safe. It's quite unsafe in certain respects, and it could become less safe. And I think I actually think the determining, the main determinant that has made the world so safe is the kind of caution-inducing effects of nuclear weapons. So I think going down the road that you're suggesting would be by far the riskiest direction. That's why we need to maintain such a strong nuclear force.
Sure.
Let me add just 3 brief points. One, I think we have more nuclear weapons than we need to have a reliable and effective deterrent. 2, if in fact you could look at the requirements, the policies that drive both the United States and Russia now to say that they need 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, you would likely see targeting requirements that probably aren't much different from what they were 30 years ago. The third point is there is underway, or has been underway for some time, this nuclear posture review implementation study being done by the president, at which point he will articulate what he thinks needs to be done in terms of targeting and what sort of nuclear forces he needs to, he believes the United States needs to have an effective deterrent. And I hope that that in this process they are looking at some of these questions. One question I would ask is, I assume, I don't know, I've never seen the targeting list, but I would assume that Russian ICBM silos are targeted. Question I would ask is why? Because I see 3 scenarios. 1, the Russians launch a bolt from the blue, in which case, if we launch back at their silos, the silos are empty.
They can't use them again.
2, there's a crisis, in which case the Russians have generated their forces, they're on alert, and they likely launch on warning. 3, where it makes sense is the United States launches a bolt from the blue, which I don't think we're going to do. So in those kinds of questions, does targeting Russian silos, which I assume we do, make sense? And I'm hoping that kind of fundamental relook is going, because I think that's what you may need to come up with a rationale for perhaps a significantly reduced force.
Can I just point? I mean, I actually agree. I mean, I think there's a very strong case to be made not to target certainly Russian silos, but that does suggest that what is left to be targeted are I mean, essentially, if you immunize the strategic forces and the command and control capabilities, which I think is generally speaking a good idea, you are left with, certainly with the general war plan, you're left with what are called value targets. Obviously, they're intermediate targets, general purpose forces, and that kind of thing. But I think that there's no getting away ultimately from the moral difficulty of that problem.
All right. We have time for 2 last questions right there and right here. And then I'll also give panelists a chance to last word if they want.
Stephen Young with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I appreciate very much the very reasonable discussion we've had here today. My question is, how do we deal with, I think, the unreasonable actor in the room, which is the U.S. House, which is calling for a study on deploying ground-based systems in East Coast, even though National Academy says they don't work. That's calling for a study on China, arguing the titles will allow China to have a far larger nuclear arsenal than anyone else believes is possible. Do we just ignore the House going forward? What do we do in a situation where the House is causing us to take actions that make no logical sense?
Okay, and then let's take Jan up here, and then I'll give you.
Jan Lodel. A quick point about Steve's very good comments on ballistic missile defense. Actually, I think it's the case that if you stopped at phase 3 and the SM-3, that you limit the velocity to 5 kilometers per second, which actually the Russians agreed to in
1997.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is some room there for something if the U.S. is prepared to even conditionally set that as a limit. But more broadly, none of you have mentioned President Obama's Prague Initiative. He's indicated privately to some people that he's still very committed to it and wants to try to, he knows he's not going to achieve it in his term. He's already said that, but he wants to try to open some kind of viable path toward eventual elimination and zero. And I guess the question is whether you feel that the things that you're talking about are reasonable steps to accomplish that, or whether there's something that you would have to add to this agenda if one wanted to be serious about that.
Another great question. Is there anything left of the Prague agenda? Who would like to start on both points?
Yeah, I'll go first. In answer to Stephen's question, I think the way forward, when you look at nuclear weapon spending, it seems to me that the position that all of the shopping list has to be done is unreasonable, because I don't think it's possible. And equally well, the position that everything has to be opposed and none of it has to be done, I think is an unreasonable position. So in terms of moving forward, I think the issue for me is, can the United States create a consensus on spending on the most stabilizing parts of the nuclear force in return for arms control? The irony is, I think the biggest threat to the nuclear weapons budget is Tea Party members of the House of Representatives, which means then that there has to be a consensus between Democrats in the House, who are generally in favor of arms control and disarmament measures, with people like the labs. And one of the questions I'm asking myself is, can you create a consensus in which both sides feel it's better than not having that consensus in place on, disarmament and arms control going hand in hand with sensible spending on, the most stabilizing parts of the nuclear force? I don't know that's possible, but that seems to me the way forward. In answer to Jan's question, I wish I had people who could tell me what was in President Obama's mind. But I think everything there, every one of the suggestions that have been named there, advances the prospect of a world without nuclear weapons. What I want to emphasize is it's also supportable by people who don't believe that is the final goal. Because every one of those measures there, I believe, enhances US national security in and of their own right. And right now, I think there is so much that can be done, not just in terms of the measures listed here. There's plenty of other measures. There's new arms control agreements. And in terms of kind of forging the consensus, I actually think it's important right now not to make people choose between being disarmers and nuclear weapons people. I think there's so many measures that are a good idea in and of themselves because they enhance US national security and the security of US allies, that right now it's not necessary to kind of identify, and actually unhelpful to identify, particular measures that are purely directed towards the goal of zero, because there's so much that people ought to be able to agree on, even if you think zero is a bad idea.
Steve.
Okay, a few comments. I think if the president wants to pursue his vision, he's already articulated what the next step was, and that was back in 2010, where he said he wants to pursue another treaty. I think there's a shot at a treaty. It may turn out that the Russians are not prepared to deal, but I think the logical step for the president is to try to push and test the hypothesis as to whether the Russians are prepared to do an agreement that goes beyond New START. And that, though, can be done in conjunction with pursuing the various other steps that we've talked about here. Again, it's not either or. Second, I would agree completely with James's point. If the Democrats in Congress could organize themselves in the way that the Republicans were organized in the debate over New START, where they went to the administration and said, in order to get the votes you need for New START treaty ratification, you have to make these commitments to strategic modernization. If the Democrats could organize themselves so they could go to the Republicans and say, if you want our support for strategic modernization, you have to make these commitments to sensible arms control, you could get a virtuous cycle. And I say this as one who's closer to the Democratic side than the Republican side. I'm not sure the Democrats can organize themselves that way, but it would be useful. Finally, the last point, I think, though, how Congress plays here, and this really is on the Senate. If the Senate begins to draw or if groups in the Senate begin to draw very hard lines that suggest that no treaty that an Obama administration could negotiate is going to be ratified, then I think what the Senate is going to do is push the administration to look at these other ways, basically go around it. So I think there is a certain risk there. I mean, again, I think in the ideal world, the treaty is probably the best way to go. But if you can't get a treaty either because the Russians aren't prepared to negotiate one, or if because you're persuaded that there's no way the Senate would ever consent to ratification of one, then you're going to look at steps less than treaties to advance the agenda.
Last word?
Sure. Yeah. On the first question, I mean, I think it's somewhat unfair. I mean, the deal was there, right? In connection with the New Start Treaty, and I think James pointed out that, or Ambassador Piper, that it was exhaustively negotiated. That was essentially the deal in exchange for the New Start Treaty, which I think both made sense. But the most important part of that, from my perspective, was the modernization of the strategic forces, and that I think there's a sense, on the right side of the spectrum, that commitment has not been honored. Now, people like Jeffrey Lewis point out that the Budget Control Act intervenes, and that the Tea Party, et cetera, all of these there's validity to that point. But I think the fundamental way to look at it is, look, there are people out there who hate arms control and think arms control is treasonous and will never be a good idea. Okay, you're not going to bring them over. But if you can bring people like Bob Corker and Johnny Isaacson and Lamar Alexander over, like you did in the New Start negotiations, then that forms a lasting consensus, which was the most valuable product of the New Start agreement, which I think it's also tragic that seems not to have carried over, at least in a potent way. And that I think, if there's that focus on modernizing, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what James means by the stabilizing elements of the triad, but I think the nuclear enterprise as it exists, maybe narrowed a little bit, and again, maybe stretched over a long period of time. Obviously, I'm conscious of the budget considerations, things like the ICBM. Maybe you do what you did with the submarines, and you stretch it a little bit more than you initially anticipated. But I think that is the basic deal. We have a strong nuclear triad. We have a strong lab complex, and so forth. And then we have arms control, and we look for ways to minimize nuclear dangers and instability. On the President Obama's agenda, it's interesting. I spent the first couple of years of the Obama administration trying to figure out who was the main driver in the administration behind the zero agenda, because I looked at a lot of the people in the Pentagon, and I was like, well, they don't seem like real zero people. And then I thought, oh, maybe it's the president. And I think I think it's actually true. And I think
that took several years.
I'm not that bright, so it's a little slow. But what I think one interesting aspect of that is how committed he is to nonproliferation. I think James touched on that, where he said that those who support arms control are also the people who need to be really vehement on nonproliferation. And James and I were out in visiting the National Test Site about a year and a half ago, and we were in the car, and we came up with a way of dividing the kind of or charting nuclear policy disputes. And there's a more traditional Cold War one, which is how hard or how easy is deterrence. But there's also one, the y-axis you could call it, which is how stable is the nuclear order. And I think the president is pretty low, if you will, on the axis, in the sense that he thinks it's pretty unstable. And that's why I tend to be a little bit more or a little less. I think that deterrence could work against Iran, but it doesn't seem like the president thinks that. In large part, as he said, I think in his interview, I think it was with Jeffrey Goldberg, that you'd see proliferation ensue. So I think he seems to be very committed. I think things like this make a lot of sense. That said, it seems to me zero has sort of exhausted itself after about 5 years of being at the top of the agenda. Obviously it'll come back because it speaks to some moral intuition on the part of large numbers of people. But then what takes its place? I mean, my candidate would be something like strategic stability, which obviously is something some people think of as old think. But I don't see zero making huge inroads. Even if there is another agreement with the Russians, it's likely to be incremental. So a little more of a pessimistic outlook, at least.
All right. This conversation, I think, has done the most that you can ask for this kind of thing. It's brought some important new ideas in front of us. It's sparked a really interesting conversation, and it's opened some new questions. So I want to thank both our panelists and the other authors, present and absent, Plowshares for making this possible, and all of you for making it happen. But in particular to the panel, thank you so much.
Thank you.